The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 17-year-old Daniel sat in the back row of courtroom 7B, clutching a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to his late father. His sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor as he shifted nervously in his seat, drawing annoyed glances from the people around him. He was wearing his best clothes, but to everyone else in the room, he still looked like a kid who'd wandered in from the local high school. Daniel was here on behalf of Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor who lived 2 doors down from his apartment. She was being evicted from the rent-controlled apartment she'd called home for 32 years. The landlord wanted her out so he could renovate and charge triple the rent to someone else. Mrs. Patterson couldn't afford a lawyer, and after what happened to her, Daniel couldn't just sit back and watch her lose everything. When the bailiff called the case, Daniel stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom. His hands were sweating, but he tried to keep his face calm and professional. He'd practiced this moment 100 times in front of his bathroom mirror. Judge Harold Pemberton looked up from his paperwork with raised eyebrows. He was in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His black robe made him look even more intimidating as he peered down from his elevated bench. "Excuse me, young man," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a courtroom, not a playground. Are you lost? The juvenile court is in the East Wing." A few people in the gallery chuckled. Daniel felt his cheeks burn, but he kept walking forward. "Your Honor, I'm here to represent Mrs. Helen Patterson in the eviction proceeding," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. The judge let out a short laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Represent? Son, where's your attorney? Did they send you here to drop off some papers?" "No, Your Honor, I am the attorney," Daniel replied, reaching into his briefcase to pull out his bar certification and identification. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and scattered laughter. Even the court reporter looked up with an amused expression. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache, shook his head with a grin. Judge Pemberton snatched the documents from Daniel's hand and studied them with narrowed eyes, holding them up to the light as if searching for signs of forgery. His lips pursed tighter with each passing second. "This has got to be some kind of joke," the judge muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You expect me to believe that you, a child who probably can't even drive yet, passed the bar exam?" "I'm 17, Your Honor, and yes, I passed the bar exam last year. Everything is in order and verified by the State Bar Association," Daniel said quietly. On the other side of the aisle, the landlord's attorney, a man named Gerald Hutchins, was loving every minute of this. He was a veteran lawyer in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. He leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, already counting this as an easy win. Judge Pemberton adjusted his reading glasses and stared at Daniel like he was some kind of curious specimen in a jar. "All right then, counselor," he said, practically spitting out the word with sarcasm. "Let's see if you actually know anything. Can you tell the court what the statute of limitations is for filing an unlawful detainer action in this state?" "Certainly, Your Honor. There's no statute of limitations for unlawful detainer actions as they're not subject to limitation periods in the traditional sense. However, the action must be filed within a reasonable time after the notice period expires, and the notice itself must comply with specific statutory requirements including—" "I didn't ask for a lecture," Judge Pemberton interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Anyone could memorize that from the internet." Daniel bit his tongue. He wanted to point out that the judge had literally asked him to explain, but he knew better than to argue right now. "Let me try something harder," the judge continued, clearly enjoying himself now. "What's the difference between actual and constructive eviction?" Daniel answered flawlessly, citing relevant case law and specific code sections from memory. But no matter how accurate his responses were, Judge Pemberton found ways to dismiss them. Too rehearsed, too textbook, probably copied from Wikipedia. The other people in the courtroom were watching this exchange like it was some kind of entertainment. Some looked sympathetic toward Daniel, but most seemed to think this was amusing. Who did this kid think he was, coming into a real courtroom and playing dress-up as a lawyer? "Your Honor, if we could proceed with the actual hearing," Daniel said, trying to regain control of the situation. "My client is present, and I have substantial evidence that—" "We'll proceed when I say we'll proceed," Judge Pemberton snapped. "And frankly, I'm still not convinced this isn't some kind of elaborate prank. How do I know you didn't just print these documents off your home computer?" Gerald Hutchins cleared his throat. barely suppressing his laughter. Your Honor, perhaps we should contact the Bar Association to verify, though I hate to waste the court's valuable time on what's clearly a misunderstanding. Daniel's jaw clenched. He'd prepared for skepticism, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. He glanced back at Mrs. Patterson, who sat in the front row looking worried and confused. She'd trusted him with her home, her entire life. He couldn't let her down, no matter how hard this judge tried to humiliate him. The Bar Association's verification hotline is available, Your Honor, Daniel said firmly. My license number is on the documentation. They can confirm everything in less than 5 minutes. Judge Pemberton looked annoyed that Daniel had called his bluff. He clearly wanted to dismiss this whole thing without actually having to check. But with the courtroom watching and waiting, he had no choice. He instructed his clerk to make the call. Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Daniel stood there, briefcase in hand, while whispers circulated through the gallery. Gerald Hutchins was texting on his phone, probably telling his colleagues about the ridiculous scene playing out in court. The judge tapped his fingers impatiently on the bench, already planning his next condescending remark. Finally, the clerk returned and whispered something in Judge Pemberton's ear. The judge's expression darkened, but he said nothing. The documents were legitimate. Daniel was exactly who he claimed to be, but even with confirmation, Judge Pemberton wasn't ready to show any respect. If anything, he seemed more determined to prove that this teenager had no business being in his courtroom. As Judge Pemberton continued to stall the proceedings with unnecessary questions, Daniel's mind drifted back to how he'd ended up here. It wasn't the path most 17-year-olds took, that was for sure. Daniel had always been different. While other kids in kindergarten were learning their ABCs, he was reading chapter books. By 2nd grade, his teachers didn't know what to do with him anymore. He'd finish his assignments in minutes and then sit there, bored out of his mind, waiting for everyone else to catch up. His mom, Rachel, worked as a paralegal at a community legal aid office. She was a single mother who juggled 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Daniel's dad had died in a construction accident when Daniel was only 4, leaving them with nothing but medical bills and memories. Growing up, Daniel spent most of his afternoons at his mom's office because they couldn't afford childcare. While other kids were at soccer practice or watching cartoons, he was sitting in the corner of a cramped legal office, surrounded by case files and law books. At first, he just drew pictures to pass the time, but then he started reading. The law fascinated him. It was like a giant puzzle where every piece had to fit perfectly. By the time he was 8, he was reading actual case files and asking his mom questions that stunned her. Why did this judge rule this way? What does jurisdiction mean? How come this person won their case but that person didn't when the situation seemed similar? His mom encouraged his curiosity, even when her coworkers thought it was weird. She'd bring home old textbooks from the office and Daniel would devour them. When he was 10, one of the attorneys at the firm gave him a practice LSAT test as a joke. Daniel scored in the 90th percentile. That's when everyone realized this wasn't just a smart kid. This was something else entirely. School became a problem. Daniel was miserable in regular classes, and his mom couldn't afford private schools or special programs. They lived paycheck to paycheck as it was, but then a guidance counselor told them about online programs for gifted students. Daniel could take college courses from home, moving at his own pace. By 12, Daniel was taking classes from a state university online. Constitutional law, contract law, criminal procedure. While his former classmates were dealing with middle school drama, he was writing papers about appellate court decisions. It was lonely sometimes, sure. He didn't have many friends his age. But the law made sense to him in a way that nothing else did. His mom worked herself to exhaustion to pay for his courses. She picked up weekend shifts, did freelance paralegal work at night, sold everything they didn't absolutely need. She believed in him when nobody else did. When people told her she was pushing her son too hard, she'd just smile and say Daniel was pushing himself and she was just trying to keep up. At 14, Daniel completed his undergraduate degree. At 15, he was accepted into an accelerated online law school program. It was grueling. He studied 12 hours a day, sometimes more. While teenagers his age were going to prom and getting their driver's licenses, Daniel was learning about torts and civil procedure. The hardest part wasn't the studying, it was the isolation. He tried to make friends online, but it was hard to relate to people. He was too young for his classmates and too educated for people his own age. His mom worried about him, but Daniel assured her he was fine. The law was his friend, his passion, his entire world. When he turned 16, he took the bar exam. His mom drove him to the testing center, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She waited in the parking lot for 6 hours while he took the test, too nervous to leave. When Daniel walked out, he looked exhausted but calm. He told her he thought he'd done okay. 3 months later, the results came. Daniel had passed. Not just passed, but scored in the top 2% of all test takers in the state. At 16 years and 4 months old, he became the youngest licensed attorney in state history. The news picked up the story. Local channels did segments on the teen genius. National media reached out for interviews. People called him a prodigy, a wonder kid, the future of law. But Daniel didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to practice law and help people. That's when reality hit him hard. No law firm would hire him. He sent out dozens of applications. Some never responded. Others sent polite rejection letters. A few partners actually laughed when he showed up for interviews, thinking it was some kind of joke. Even the ones who believed his credentials were real, worried about what clients would think. Who wants to be represented by someone who can't even vote yet? One senior partner told him bluntly to come back in 10 years when he looked the part. Another said hiring him would be a liability nightmare. The rejection stung more than Daniel wanted to admit, but his mom's boss at the legal aid office gave him an idea. Why not start his own practice? Help people in the community who couldn't afford fancy lawyers anyway. People who cared more about results than appearances. So Daniel set up shop in their tiny apartment. He converted the corner of their living room into his office. One desk, one laptop, one filing cabinet from a thrift store, and a phone number listed in the community newsletter. He took cases nobody else wanted. Small claims disputes, tenant rights issues, immigration paperwork, disability appeals. His first case was helping a veteran get his benefits restored. Daniel won. Then he helped a family fight an insurance company that denied their claim. He won that too. Word spread slowly through the neighborhood. This kid lawyer actually knew what he was doing. Mrs. Patterson was his 7th client. She'd knocked on his door 3 weeks ago, crying because she'd received an eviction notice. Her landlord claimed she'd violated her lease, but Daniel read through everything and knew immediately something wasn't right. The evidence was sloppy. The timeline didn't match. This wasn't about lease violations. This was about greed. He'd taken her case for free, just like all the others. His mom worried they needed the money, but Daniel couldn't charge people who had nothing. He'd figure out the money part later. Now, standing in this courtroom with Judge Pemberton treating him like an annoying child, Daniel felt the weight of all those years of sacrifice. His childhood spent in law libraries instead of playgrounds. His mom's exhausted face after working double shifts. The loneliness of being different. But he also felt something else. Determination. Because Mrs. Patterson was counting on him. And he'd be damned if he let some arrogant judge intimidate him into backing down. Judge Pemberton finally allowed the hearing to begin, but his attitude hadn't improved one bit. If anything, he seemed even more determined to make Daniel's life difficult. Every time Daniel tried to speak, the judge interrupted him with sarcastic comments or unnecessary questions. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that the eviction notice was improperly served," Daniel began, pulling documents from his briefcase. "Oh, you'd like to present evidence?" Judge Pemberton said mockingly. "How generous of you to ask permission in my own courtroom. Tell me, son, do they teach basic courtroom procedure in whatever online course you took?" Daniel felt his face flush but kept his composure. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the procedure." "If I may continue." "You may not," the judge snapped. "First, I want to see if you even know what you're talking about. What constitutes proper service of an eviction notice in this jurisdiction?" Daniel answered perfectly, citing the exact statute and its requirements. But Judge Pemberton just waved his hand dismissively, like Daniel was reciting something he'd memorized 5 minutes ago without actually understanding it. Across the aisle, Gerald Hutchins was practically glowing with confidence. He kept checking his watch like this whole thing was a waste of his valuable time. At one point, he actually yawned, not even bothering to cover his mouth. This was going to be the easiest win of his career. When Daniel finally got to present his arguments, Judge Pemberton barely looked at the evidence. Daniel had spent weeks preparing this case. He'd found proof that the landlord had violated multiple housing codes. Water damage that hadn't been repaired, faulty electrical wiring, a broken heating system that left Mrs. Patterson freezing through last winter. All violations of the warranty of habitability. Your Honor, these photographs show clear evidence of code violations that the landlord failed to address, despite multiple written requests from my client, Daniel said, holding up a folder full of documentation. Judge Pemberton glanced at the photos for maybe 3 seconds. These could be from any apartment. How do I know your client didn't just print these off the internet? They're time-stamped and geotagged, Your Honor. I also have the original inspection reports from the City Housing Authority that— Enough, the judge said. I've been on this bench for 28 years. I don't need a child telling me how to evaluate evidence. Daniel's hands tightened on his briefcase. He could feel Mrs. Patterson's worried eyes on his back. She'd trusted him with everything. Her home, her future. And this judge was treating the whole thing like a joke. But Daniel wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Your Honor, I'd also like to point out that this case has a precedent in your own previous rulings, Daniel said calmly. Judge Pemberton's head snapped up. Excuse me? 2 months ago, in the case of Thompson versus Riverside Properties, you ruled that failure to maintain habitable conditions constitutes grounds for dismissing an eviction proceeding. The circumstances in that case are nearly identical to Mrs. Patterson's situation. The courtroom went quiet. Even Gerald Hutchins stopped scrolling through his phone. Judge Pemberton's face started turning red. How dare you presume to tell me about my own rulings? I'm not presuming, Your Honor. I'm simply citing relevant case law. It's public record, Daniel said, keeping his voice respectful but firm. In fact, I've reviewed every case you've presided over in the past 3 years as part of my preparation for this hearing. The judge looked like he was about to explode. You reviewed what? All your publicly available decisions, Your Honor. It's standard practice for thorough case preparation. In Thompson versus Riverside Properties, you stated, and I quote, that landlords cannot use eviction proceedings as retaliation when tenants report code violations. Mrs. Patterson reported violations 4 times before receiving her eviction notice. Gerald Hutchins was frantically flipping through his legal pad now, clearly realizing he hadn't done nearly as much homework as this teenager. Furthermore, Daniel continued, gaining confidence in Martinez versus Golden Gate Apartments, you ruled that improper service of eviction notices renders the entire proceeding invalid. In Lewis versus Parkside Management, you held that photographic evidence of code violations, when properly authenticated, must be given due consideration. Daniel pulled out more documents, and in Henderson versus Metropolitan Housing, you specifically stated that the age or appearance of an attorney has no bearing on the validity of their arguments. You wrote in that decision that justice should be blind to such superficial factors. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Pemberton stared at Daniel like he was seeing him for the first time. The smug expression had vanished from Gerald Hutchins's face, replaced by something close to panic. Daniel wasn't finished, though. He'd saved his best argument for last. Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence I'd like to submit, Daniel said, pulling out a sealed envelope. This is time-stamped security camera footage from Mrs. Patterson's apartment building. What does that have to do with anything? Gerald Hutchins interjected, his voice losing its earlier confidence. Everything, actually, Daniel replied. According to the documents filed with this court, Mrs. Patterson was personally served with her eviction notice on September 15th at 2:30 in the afternoon. The process server swore under oath that he handed the documents directly to her at her apartment door. Daniel opened the envelope and pulled out several printed screenshots. However, this security footage shows that no one approached Mrs. Patterson's apartment on September 15th. In fact, Mrs. Patterson herself wasn't even home that day. She was at a medical appointment, which I also have documentation for. The color drained from Gerald Hutchins's face. The process server's affidavit states he served her in person, Daniel continued. But that's impossible because she wasn't there and neither was he. This footage covers the entire hallway leading to her apartment. No one came to her door that day. Judge Pemberton leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Are you suggesting the service documents were falsified? I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. I'm stating a fact. The affidavit of service is false, which means this entire eviction proceeding is based on fraudulent documents filed with the court. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, Gerald Hutchins stood up, his expensive suit suddenly looking a bit less impressive. Your Honor, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Perhaps there was a clerical error. A clerical error? Daniel said. The affidavit has your signature on it, Mr. Hutchins. You personally verified this service took place. Gerald Hutchins' mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. My paralegal must have. The chain of custody form shows you personally handled these documents, Daniel said, holding up more evidence. You signed off on them. You submitted them to the court. Either you knowingly filed false documents, or you submitted legal paperwork without verifying its accuracy. Either way, that's a serious problem. Judge Pemberton's expression had completely changed. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by genuine shock and what might have been a hint of embarrassment. He looked at Gerald Hutchins, then at the security footage screenshots, then back at Daniel. For the first time since the hearing began, the judge seemed to be actually seeing Daniel not as some kid playing lawyer, but as a real attorney who'd just exposed a major ethical violation in his courtroom. Mr. Hutchins, Judge Pemberton said slowly, his voice ice cold, I think you'd better have a very good explanation for this. But Gerald Hutchins didn't have an explanation. He just stood there, speechless, while a 17-year-old attorney in sneakers quietly gathered his evidence and waited for justice to finally be served. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. What started as a mockery of Daniel had turned into something else entirely. Judge Pemberton sat up straighter in his chair, his earlier smugness replaced by the serious demeanor of a judge who'd just realized something very wrong had happened in his courtroom. Mr. Hutchins, Judge Pemberton repeated, his voice sharp as a knife. I asked you a question. How do you explain filing an affidavit of service that appears to be completely fabricated? Gerald Hutchins fumbled with his papers, sweat beginning to show on his forehead despite the cool courtroom air. Your Honor, I assure you this must be some kind of misunderstanding. My office handles hundreds of cases, and sometimes you file false documents with the court. Judge Pemberton interrupted. His tone was completely different now. The condescending judge who'd mocked Daniel was gone. In his place was a man who took his courtroom very seriously. No, Your Honor, of course not, Gerald stammered. What I meant was that perhaps the dates got mixed up, or maybe the process server went to the wrong address, or... Daniel stepped forward calmly. Your Honor, may I present additional evidence? Judge Pemberton nodded, and for the first time that day, he actually seemed interested in what Daniel had to say. Daniel pulled out another folder. I have records from 3 other eviction cases handled by Mr. Hutchins's firm in the past 6 months. In each case, tenants claimed they were never properly served. In each case, the affidavits of service show the same process server. And in 2 of those cases, the tenants have witnesses who can confirm they weren't home on the dates listed. The courtroom erupted in whispers. People leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't just about Mrs. Patterson anymore. This was bigger. Gerald Hutchins's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning. These other cases have nothing to do with... These cases have everything to do with this, Judge Pemberton said firmly. They establish a pattern of behavior. Sit down, Mr. Hutchins. The veteran attorney sat down heavily, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. His expensive Rolex suddenly seemed less impressive. Daniel continued, his confidence growing with each word. Your Honor, I've also discovered that the property management company Mr. Hutchins represents has been systematically targeting rent-controlled apartments. They file evictions on questionable grounds, often with improper service, hoping tenants won't have the resources to fight back. Once the apartments are vacated, they renovate and charge market rates. He laid out a chart he'd created showing the pattern. Building addresses, eviction dates, and the new rental prices after tenants left. The numbers told a clear story of corporate greed and legal manipulation. Mrs. Patterson's apartment currently rents for $850 a month, Daniel explained. According to rental listings I found online, the landlord plans to renovate it and charge $2,800. That's more than triple the current rent, and Mrs. Patterson's apartment isn't the only one. In her building alone, 6 other long-term tenants have been evicted in the past year using similar tactics. Judge Pemberton studied the chart carefully, his expression growing darker. And you have documentation for all of this? Yes, Your Honor. Rental listings, building permit applications, And affidavits from other tenants willing to testify about their experiences, Daniel said, handing over a thick stack of papers. The judge took his time reviewing everything. The courtroom stayed silent except for the sound of pages turning. Even the court reporter seemed riveted by what was unfolding. Finally, Judge Pemberton looked up. He glanced at Gerald Hutchins with barely concealed disgust, then turned his attention to Daniel. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine authority. "Mr. Hutchins, I'm going to give you one opportunity to explain yourself, and I suggest you think very carefully before you speak." Gerald Hutchins stood slowly. Gone was the cocky attorney who'd walked in expecting an easy victory. "Your Honor, I relied on my staff to handle the service of process. If there were errors, they were unintentional. I had no knowledge of any improprieties." "You signed the documents," Judge Pemberton said flatly. "Your signature means you verified their accuracy. That's not just protocol, Mr. Hutchins, that's the law." "I understand, Your Honor, but in a busy practice, you still have an ethical obligation to verify the accuracy of what you file with this court," the judge said, his voice rising. "You don't get to hide behind your staff when it's convenient. These are people's homes we're talking about. Their lives." Daniel watched as everything he'd worked for finally came together. This wasn't about him being young or Judge Pemberton being dismissive anymore. This was about justice actually being served. Judge Pemberton turned to Daniel. "Does your client wish to pursue a motion to dismiss based on improper service?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. "Additionally, we're requesting sanctions against the plaintiff and their counsel for filing fraudulent documents, and we're seeking damages for the emotional distress this improper eviction attempt has caused Mrs. Patterson." "Your Honor." "That's excessive," Gerald Hutchins protested weakly. "Excessive?" Judge Pemberton's eyebrows shot up. "What's excessive is attempting to evict an elderly woman from her home using falsified legal documents. What's excessive is a pattern of abuse targeting the most vulnerable tenants in this city." The judge looked down at his notes, then back at Daniel. For a moment, something like respect flickered in his eyes, mixed with what might have been embarrassment over how he'd treated this young attorney. "Here's what's going to happen," Judge Pemberton announced. "First, this eviction proceeding is dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Patterson will remain in her apartment." Relief washed over Daniel. He glanced back at Mrs. Patterson, who had tears streaming down her face. "Second," the judge continued, "I'm ordering the landlord to pay damages to Mrs. Patterson in the amount of $5,000 for emotional distress and legal fees." "Your Honor," Gerald Hutchins tried to object, but the judge held up his hand. "I'm not finished. Third, I'm ordering a complete inspection of the property to ensure all housing code violations are corrected within 30 days. Fourth, I'm referring this matter to the State Bar Association for investigation into potential ethical violations by Mr. Hutchins and his firm." The courtroom buzzed with reaction. People were actually clapping, which almost never happened in court. The bailiff had to call for order. Gerald Hutchins looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His perfect record, his reputation, his career, all of it was crumbling because he'd underestimated a teenager in sneakers. Judge Pemberton banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." But before everyone could leave, he added, "Mr. Chen, please approach the bench." Daniel walked forward, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what to expect. Was the judge going to find some way to criticize him even after winning? But when he got close enough, Judge Pemberton spoke quietly, his voice sincere. "I owe you an apology." Those words hung in the air between them, unexpected and powerful. Daniel stood at the bench, looking up at Judge Pemberton with cautious surprise. An apology was the last thing he'd expected from this man who'd spent the entire hearing treating him like a kid playing dress-up. "I owe you an apology," Judge Pemberton repeated, his voice low enough that only Daniel could hear. "What I did today was unprofessional, prejudiced, and frankly shameful. I let my assumptions about your age cloud my judgment, and that's inexcusable for someone in my position." Daniel didn't know what to say. He'd prepared arguments for every possible legal scenario, but he hadn't prepared for this. The judge continued, looking genuinely uncomfortable but determined to speak his piece. "I've been on this bench for 28 years. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what really matters. I started caring more about appearances, credentials, how things looked rather than what was actually true and right. You reminded me today what this job is supposed to be about." "Thank you, Your Honor," Daniel managed to say. "I appreciate that. Judge Pemberton shook his head. Don't thank me. You did your job brilliantly. Despite me trying to sabotage you at every turn, that case you presented was better researched and more thoroughly prepared than 90% of what I see from attorneys with decades of experience. He paused, then added, I'd like your permission to use what happened here today as a teaching moment. Not to embarrass myself, but to show other judges the importance of keeping an open mind. Daniel thought about it for a moment. Only if the focus stays on treating everyone fairly, not on making me some kind of poster child. I just want to practice law and help people. Agreed, the judge said, extending his hand. Daniel shook it, and for the first time that day, Judge Pemberton smiled at him with genuine warmth. Good luck, counselor. Something tells me you're going to have quite a career. As Daniel turned to leave, Mrs. Patterson was waiting for him at the courtroom doors, tears still streaming down her weathered face. She grabbed him in a tight hug that nearly knocked the breath out of him. Thank you, thank you, thank you, she kept saying, her voice choked with emotion. You saved my home. You saved everything. Daniel hugged her back, feeling his own eyes getting wet. This was why he'd studied so hard, sacrificed so much. Not for fame or money, but for moments like this. For helping someone who had nowhere else to turn. You don't have to worry anymore, Mrs. Patterson, he said softly. You're staying in your apartment. They can't touch you now. Other people from the courtroom stopped to congratulate him as he left. Some of them had been laughing at him just an hour ago, but now they looked at him with respect. Word was already spreading through the courthouse about the teenager who'd taken down a corrupt attorney and exposed a pattern of tenant abuse. By the time Daniel got home that evening, his phone was blowing up. News outlets wanted interviews. Other tenants who'd been evicted were calling his mom's number asking if he could help them too. A local legal advocacy group reached out about collaborating with him on similar cases. His mom was waiting at their apartment, having left work early when she heard how the case went. She swept him into her arms the moment he walked through the door. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, holding him tight. Your father would be so proud. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the day in his mind. The humiliation, the struggle, the victory, and finally the unexpected apology. He thought about all the other people out there facing similar situations, people who didn't have anyone to fight for them. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The local bar association launched a full investigation into Gerald Hutchins and his firm. It turned out Daniel's research had only scratched the surface. They found dozens of cases involving questionable evictions, falsified service documents, and systematic targeting of vulnerable tenants. Gerald Hutchins ended up losing his license to practice law. The story made national news. Not just local coverage, but actual network news segments about the 17-year-old attorney who'd exposed a major legal scandal. Reporters called him a genius, a prodigy, the future of justice. Daniel did a few interviews, but mostly tried to avoid the spotlight. He wasn't interested in being famous. He just wanted to do the work. Judge Pemberton kept his word, too. He spoke at a judicial conference 3 months later, using his experience with Daniel as the central example in his presentation. He didn't sugarcoat his own behavior or try to make excuses. He openly admitted he'd been wrong, biased, and had nearly let his prejudice prevent justice from being served. The video of his speech went viral in legal circles. Young attorneys, especially those from non-traditional backgrounds, reached out to thank both him and Daniel. The judge's honest acknowledgement that even experienced jurists could fall victim to bias sparked important conversations in courtrooms across the country. As for Daniel, his tiny practice in the corner of his apartment couldn't handle all the requests anymore. The legal advocacy group offered him office space for free, and several experienced attorneys volunteered to mentor him and help manage the caseload. Mrs. Patterson appointed herself as his unofficial office manager, organizing his files and scheduling appointments with the efficiency of someone who'd found her calling. 6 months after that day in court, Daniel was invited to speak at that same judicial conference Judge Pemberton had addressed. He showed up in his usual style, jeans and a hoodie, carrying the same worn briefcase that had belonged to his father. When he took the stage, there was no mockery, no condescending laughter. Just a room full of judges, attorneys, and law students who'd come to hear what this young man had to say. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers, Daniel began. I'm 17. I still can't rent a car or buy a lottery ticket. But I know this. Justice doesn't care about age or appearance or credentials. Justice only cares about truth and fairness. He talked about his journey, his mother's sacrifices, and the importance of remembering why they'd all chosen law in the first place, not for power or prestige, but to help people who needed it most. Judge Pemberton taught me something important that day, Daniel continued. Not intentionally at first, but by the end. He showed me that it's never too late to recognize our mistakes and do better. That takes more courage than being right in the first place. As he spoke, Daniel saw Judge Pemberton in the audience, nodding with that same genuine respect he'd shown at the bench that day. The judge who'd mocked him had become one of his biggest supporters, referring cases to him and advocating for more opportunities for young attorneys. After the speech, dozens of people lined up to talk to Daniel. Young lawyers who felt discouraged, law students who didn't fit the traditional mold, people who'd been told they weren't old enough, experienced enough, or polished enough to make a difference. Daniel shared his mom's phone number with all of them, told them to reach out if they needed advice or encouragement, because he remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to have doors slammed in his face. That evening, Daniel sat in his new office with Mrs. Patterson, going through case files for the week ahead. His mom stopped by with dinner as she did most nights. They ate together, talking and laughing, celebrating how far they'd come. Daniel looked at the framed newspaper article on his wall. The headline read, "Teen Attorney Exposes Eviction Fraud, Changes Courtroom Culture." But that's not what made him smile. What made him smile was the smaller article right next to it. "Elderly tenant saved from wrongful eviction, says young lawyer gave her hope." That was the real story. Not his age or his accomplishments, but the fact that Mrs. Patterson got to stay in her home. That justice had been served. That someone who'd been voiceless found someone willing to speak up for her. And tomorrow, Daniel would do it all over again for someone else who needed help. Because that's what being a lawyer really meant. Not fancy suits or impressive offices or respect based on appearances. It meant showing up, doing the work, and never letting anyone tell you that justice has an age requirement.